must be our goal and our guide. And all that we strive for as a human family, dignity and hope, progress and prosperity, depends on peace. But peace depends on us.
A very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for finding time to join me this afternoon. The show is Diaspora Dispatches, where we get to look at the news making headlines across the continent of Africa. My name is Miriam Ogutu, and we're coming to you from Kenya's capital here in Nairobi. And I'll just start us off with Niger, where heavy gunfire was heard in the area around the presidential palace in Niger's capital, Niamey, in the early hours of Wednesday. The gunfire was heard at around 3 local time, and it lasted at least 15 minutes before stopping, followed by small arms fire, local residents have said. The situation remains confused and the city is on high alert. The shooting took place less than 48 hours ahead of the inauguration of the newly elected President Mohamed Bazoum. The government has not yet reacted to these events. There has been increasing attacks by militant groups as well as political tensions in the country following Mr. Bazoum's victory in February's presidential election. His challenger and former President Mohamed Osman, who lost in the runoff, has rejected the results and announced a court ruling upholding Mr. Bazoum's victory. Head over to Ivory Coast, and the International Criminal Court will today rule on whether to uphold the acquittal of Ivory Coast former President Laurent Gbagbo. Mr. Gbagbo and his former youth leader Charles Blé Goudé were charged in connection with post-electoral violence in the West African nation more than a decade ago. The 2010 post-election violence flared when Mr. Gbagbo, who had been in power for a decade, refused to accept defeat. They were cleared of crimes against humanity in 2019. The prosecution appealed against the decision to clear Laurent Gbagbo, arguing there were procedural errors in how the original verdict was delivered and insisting that thousands of documents and 96 witnesses presented during the trial had proved his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The 75-year-old has been living in Brussels but hopes to go home if the prosecutor's appeal fails. The judgment will be closely followed in Ivory Coast, where the former president remains an influential figure in a nation still striving for political stability. Last year, there were deadly clashes with Mr. Gbagbo's long-running rival, Alassane Ouattara, announced he planned to seek a third presidential term, which he did against the constitution. Head over to South Sudan, and nearly 20 people are now known to have been killed in South Sudan's eastern Equatoria state, where Governor Louis Lobong Lojore survived an attack by heavily armed youth from the Buya community on Monday evening. His press secretary has said the angry armed youth followed the governor and attacked the military barracks camp, 15 bringing the death toll of the two incidents to nearly 20, he added. The dead include one of the governor's bodyguard and soldier's wife. 3 others were critically injured. Mr. Lotok said that the governor and his delegation were in the barracks but in a defensive position to respond to any impending attack. He says the army commander in the area has called for reinforcement from Juba to help rescue the governor and evacuate him from the troubled region. And then we go to the Central African Republic. The president of the Central African Republic, Faustin Archange Todore, has promised to reconcile the country in his second 5-year term amid a civil war and following an election rejected as fraudulent by the opposition. Hundreds of people lined the streets leading to the National Assembly, but very few had the chance to access where the inauguration took place. Mr. Todore promised to fight corruption, to revive farming, and to deploy the country's vast natural resources to restore an economy that is currently in free fall. His task will be made all that harder now that former President Francois Bozize is heading the rebel coalition that is trying to overthrow him. Much of the Central African Republic is controlled by armed groups that emerged after civil war erupted after the overthrow of the then President Bozize 8 years ago. We go to Nigeria, And Nigerians are furious after the government announced that President Muhammadu Buhari will be traveling to London, and he did yesterday for a routine medical checkup. A statement from the presidential spokesperson Femi Adesina did not reveal Buhari's condition, but assured Nigerians that the president will return home in the second week of April. Many Nigerians expressed their dismay following Buhari's trip to the UK to seek medical care. Some have called it a waste of taxpayers' money, while some criticized the government's failure to build world-class hospitals in Nigeria. A human rights activist, Omoyele Sowore, has advised Nigerians in the United Kingdom to occupy the London hospital where Buhari plans to have a medical checkup. Buhari has visited London for medical reasons since he was first inaugurated president on May 29, 2015. On February 5, 2016, Buhari embarked on a 6-day medical vacation. Who goes to medical vacation, first of all? How do you go for a medical vacation? But he did in London for an undisclosed condition. He spent 104 days in 2017 after a long medical visit in London. He then spent nearly 2 months in London in January and February and said on his return in early March that he had never been so ill. In 2017, there was a series of protests in Abuja demanding that Buhari return or quit if he was unable to go on. Meanwhile, Nigerian doctors will begin their strike on April 1st to protest about delayed salaries, among other vital issues. So the doctors in your country have organized a strike about their delayed salaries and other vital issues and their working conditions. And you, as the president of that country, you take off and go seeking medical attention or vacation or whatever it is that you're calling it, President Buhari, in another country. Quite interesting. Okay, and then we head over to Cameroon, and Cameroonian Prime Minister Joseph Dion Ngute said chaos in the Central African Republic has stalled development efforts and peace initiatives in Cameroon. Ngute met Monday night with Faustin Archange Tudore before Tuesday's second inauguration of the Central African Republic leader. Ngute said Cameroonian President Paul Biya, who sent him to Bangui for the inauguration, has hopes that Tudore's leadership will bring back peace to the Central African Republic, by extension to Cameroon. He said both Cameroon and the Central African Republic can never have peace or develop if there is a crisis in any of the two states. He said two countries are neighbors that must accept one another citizens in case there is a crisis. And then we go to South Sudan. We go back to South Sudan, and the White House has extended the national emergency on South Sudan in order to deal with what it describes as unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. President Joe Biden says the current situation in the country is marked by activity that threaten the peace, security, or stability of South Sudan and the surrounding region. He affirmed that this situation includes widespread violence and atrocities, human rights abuses, recruitment and use of child soldiers, attacks on peacekeepers, and obstruction of humanitarian operations. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act authorizes President Biden to regulate international commerce in response to any unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States, which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States. It was first declared by former President Barack Obama in 2014, a few months after war erupted in Juba in December 2013. The order meant that the transfer of assets in the form of property or interest would be blocked for some individuals where actions are considered to threaten peace in South Sudan. It also affects those who threaten transitional agreements, expand the conflict, and commit human rights violations and target women and children. The order was extended several times during the war that ended in 2018. In a nutshell, this is sanctions. That's what we're talking about. So we see there President of the U.S., Joe Biden, is now extending the same sanctions. He's continuing them or renewing them. So there you go. And still staying with South Sudan, and a senior political leader has criticized the statement by the Office of the President in which it said elections in South Sudan will not be held next year. Dr. Lam Akol, leader of the National Democratic Movement and a signatory to the 2018 Revitalized Peace Agreement, said pronouncements that affect the spirit of the agreement are not taken unilaterally. it is not the right of any party to decide what to do regarding provisions of the peace agreement. That is what he's quoted as saying. South Sudanese are supposed to go for their polls in 2022. But this week, the Minister of Presidential Affairs in a statement said the government is not prepared to organize any elections. So that marks the end of our bulletin this afternoon. And I think this story, we talked about it yesterday, and maybe I'll just reiterate a few things there, and then we'll just call it a day. Well, we know the revitalized peace agreement. One of the agreements was to have election in 2022. There was a transition government. They're supposed to put their house in order. South Sudan plunged into chaos 2 years after just becoming a country, a state, in 2013. Given the independence in 2011. 2013, they plunged into chaos. So since then, it has not really known stability, peace of any kind of form or shape there in South Sudan. But that there has been some peace talks. So the 2018 one, the one we keep talking about here, the revitalized peace agreement, it is revitalized because there had been some peace agreements before that prior that had failed tremendously. So this 2018, I think, is the one that was expected to hold. Well, so far, as much as it has not bore so much fruit so far, but still, that is something that we have to hold on to there, the people of South Sudan, because that is what has the binding agreement for all parties involved there in South Sudan. So the stakeholders, it's not just President Salva Kiir or his first Vice President, Dr. Riek Machar, or others. There's so many people that were involved in signing this peace agreement. And so yesterday we talked about it. And the other day, I think, when I saw this news, President of South Sudan, President Salva Kiir, saying that South Sudan is not in a position to go for an election in 2022, which is one of the requirements of the revitalized peace agreement of 2018, all right? But the problem with that now, we're seeing what is happening. Other players that also are signatories to the revitalized peace agreement of 2018 were not consulted. So according to them, some of the content or the articles of this revitalized peace, which is to have an election next year, in their opinion, still stands, because President Salva Kiir and the rest of the stakeholders have not met to decide otherwise. So this person here, Dr. Lam Akol, who is the leader of the National Democratic Movement and also a signatory to the 2018 Revitalized Peace Agreement, is saying that is not a decision you make by yourself, President Salva Kiir. You have not consulted with the rest of the stakeholders. You have not consulted with everybody else who was involved in this tedious, daunting task of signing this peace deal with the hopes of rebuilding South Sudan and finding peace for South Sudan. So for you to even go ahead and make these pronouncements without consulting with other stakeholders, I think, he did not say that, but from where I see it, I think it's quite in disregard of the rest of the stakeholders, and also seems to be setting up South Sudan to another path of the unknown. Because if President Salva Kiir, from where you see it, you feel having elections next year is not viable, what you needed to do as a responsible leader, and I think by using that, I'm giving you maybe a little too much credit, but as a leader of South Sudan, you should have called everybody on board and say, you know what, these are the optics, this is what we're dealing with, this is where our country is right now. What do you think? Are we in a position to go to the elections next year? Or what is another alternative? But you just don't wake up one morning and make these pronouncements without consulting with the rest of the stakeholders. So Mr. Salva Kiir, by you going ahead and doing this, you are already setting up South Sudan to a path that might take off the gains that have been made by even the re-signing of that other agreement last year in February, which is over a year old now, that had to be postponed so many times. But finally it was done, and Riek Machar came back to Juba. Remember, he had stayed in Khartoum for quite a while. Before Khartoum, he was under house arrest in South Africa, and then he was brought to Khartoum for a long time. So you guys signed that peace deal. He came back to Juba and some of other stakeholders. And so we've been sitting here waiting to hear what is really going on there in South Sudan and the rest of the stakeholders there. So for you, Mr. Salva Kiir, and your office and your leadership, to decide on your part and come out and make this pronouncement that an election is not viable, is not possible for the year 2022. You're not even halfway in the year 2021, but you've decided 2022 elections not possible. And yet, this was agreed upon with other stakeholders, but you did not care to consult and bring everybody on board and just explain what is really happening and get to hear everybody else's opinion. I think is wrong, and you're not showing leadership, President Salva Kiir. And there is somebody who had gone to the United Nations. His name is Bier. He's a political activist. He was arrested and later released in 2020, and then he ran away to the U.S. And when he was giving his testimony and his what he thinks is going on there in South Sudan, he was being grilled. He said, you know what, the leadership in South Sudan is not very keen on having elections. The leadership of South Sudan has not even set up structures where they can go conduct a census, take the population there in South Sudan, and make a voters register and make sure that South Sudanese are registered to go for their votes. So they've not met even the basic requirements to allow for them to go for an election. And I agree with him, but also when you look at South Sudan, the way it is right now, and I think I talked about this yesterday, the way it is right now, with so many refugees, South Sudanese refugees in Kenya, in South Sudan itself, in Uganda, and the rest of the world, I was just wondering, okay, fine, should they now decide we need to go conduct a census? Where are they going to count these people? In the refugee camps? Excuse me, if I'm living in the refugee camps, if I see a government official, I want to know, when am I leaving this camp? When is my security going to be assured so that I can go back to my home, go back to my village and rebuild my life? I don't hear anything to do with election. That is just one perspective, because that is something they have to deal with. Otherwise, who are they going to be counting? Because people are running away from their villages. If you watch this show, then you know reports coming from South Sudan is that there has been an increase in communal violence in South Sudan because of so many factors that I will not get into right now. So that is something that President Salva Kiir has to deal with. Fine, they decide to go to take the census, and then they decide to put up the registry. Kiir is saying we don't even have the money to do that. But that activist was saying what the government of South Sudan lacks is the will to do that, to do right by the people of South Sudan. And I've said here before, and I'll repeat it today, and I'll repeat it tomorrow, that as much as these other factors also come into play, but true, the leadership of South Sudan does not have the will to find a solution, a lasting solution for a peaceful South Sudan. Because now look at this new move by President Salva Kiir. If he sits by himself and decides we are not going to go for an election, and he has not consulted other stakeholders, are we not creating more problems there? Are we moving forward, or are we going back? Because as much as he is the president of South Sudan, but we know how South Sudan's leadership is constituted right now, he has to consult. He has to call his first vice president and the rest of them. They have about 5 vice presidents, but you do have the first vice president, which is Dr. Riek Machar, and then the rest of them come along. And other stakeholders, bring them on board, sit them down and say, you know what, this is what is happening. This is the situation that you're dealing with right now. This is how much money we have as a country. This is where we are. Is it viable? Can we have an election out of respect of other stakeholders and just showing leadership, period? But in this regard, just President Salva Kiir on his own coming out and making these pronouncements, I think, is already setting up South Sudan for a losing situation there, because this is just one person who is a signatory to the 2018 peace deal. So we're waiting to see more people coming in who are stakeholders in this thing and saying, hey, we don't agree with what President Salva Kiir said. We don't agree with that pronouncement. And why did he not consult with us? And where will that leave the people of South Sudan, who has been waiting with bated breath, hoping that they'll find a solution? Perhaps they'll go to the election, and then they'll see how to move forward as a country. So President Salva Kiir, I think on this one, you are wrong for doing that, and you should have consulted. And now you're seeing other people complaining. It's just a matter of time. Let's just wait and see how the rest of them will come out and how this information will be received. Okay. I don't want to get too much into the rest of the stories, but that gunfire that happened around the presidential palace in Niger's capital, Niamey, in the early hours of Wednesday. I remember the incumbent lost after they went for a runoff. So here the opposition leader was elected the president there. So it's less than that gunfire happened just less than 48 hours before the inauguration of the new president. And we know Niger has been also a hotspot for militants, extremist activities there. But this being heard at the presidential palace, what is really happening? The president does not want to leave, or what? You know, he was defeated in the election. They went for a re-election, a rerun. He was still defeated. So what is the problem? He does not want to leave, or what? So let's just wait and see. I think the inauguration should be taking place tomorrow or thereabout, I think. And so we shall be following that story and see how that will work out, even as former president of Ivory Coast, Laurent Gbagbo, awaits the verdict there from the International Criminal Court. Remember, he was acquitted. So, and then the prosecutor went and challenged that. And so we're waiting to hear if the court will uphold his acquittal. That is supposed to be happening, today. And so perhaps tomorrow I shall be back here to report to you what really had happened there at the International Criminal Court. Thank you so much for watching and for your time. My name is Miriam Ogutu. Bye-bye for now.
Peace must be our goal and our guide. And all that we strive for as a human family, dignity and hope, progress and prosperity, depends on peace. But peace depends on us.